right, good morning, everybody. All right, well, good morning. Welcome to week 15, the final week of lectures before next week's finals week of CNET58. So today we're going to wrap up the material that you'll need to know for this course. And this week there's also quiz number 4, which is available on Canvas. And you have until 11:59 p.m. on Sunday night to take that. So again, that's quiz 4, open book, open note, same as all the other formats. Just do it on Canvas and I'll get it graded. And we also will have lab 14 this week, which is really, it's kind of a practice lab final lab. So if you can navigate through this week's lab, you're not going to have any problems with the lab final next week, okay? And then as far as next week being finals week, the way that's going to work for us is everything will open. The final exam, which is on Canvas, 100 questions, true, false, multiple choice, fill in the blank. That will open on Canvas at 12:01 a.m. on Monday morning. So that's June 7th. And it will remain open until Friday, June 11th at 11:59 p.m. So please note that the finals week is only Monday through Friday. It's not through Sunday, okay? Because that will give me time to get everything graded, because I have to turn around and have all grades submitted by Tuesday of the week after that. So I only have a couple days. And if I go to Sunday night, that really leaves me until Monday to start grading. And with the lab final and some of those things, it might take longer than that. So, and the official finals week ends on Friday. So that's the stop date. So keep that in mind, and I'll send out an announcement. I'll probably make a video announcement as well later this week or early next week that says finals week is from Monday until Friday. All right. So you'll be able to log in to Canvas, take the final exam anytime next week before Friday at 11:59 p.m. And then you'll also be able to log in and have access to the lab final, and you can work on that next week anytime. So we will not have a Tuesday 8 a.m. class meeting time on finals week. So you're just going to be on your own to work your way through the final exam and the lab final. And again, like I said, today's lab is a dry run. It's a practice lab final lab. So the things that are introduced today, obviously I give you instructions. On the lab final, I just give you bullet points, do this. And the assumption is you'll be able to, look back on this week and get that taken care of. All right, any questions or comments on this week or next week? You can just pop those into the chat if you have anything. We'll go from there. All right, since there aren't any, I'm going to, okay, Robert, good, all good there. So Frankie said, so we meet up on Tuesday next week? No, next week there is no scheduled meeting time. You are just on your own between Monday and Friday to take care of the lab final and the final exam, which are both on Canvas, okay? So Frankie, there is no meeting. Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, and the way today's going to kind of look is there's some material I want to cover. We're going to talk about the deployment services and installing our server operating systems. I also want to take a brief look at VPNs, at least from a lecture standpoint. And then we'll get into the lab. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time and you can hear the trucks are outside, but hopefully that doesn't bother you too much. I want to spend a little bit of time where we will go through and kind of get some of the things started on the lab. I did not make a recording of this week's lab. The instructions are really straightforward. A lot of it is stuff you've done at least 3 or 4 times already. So again, this is kind of a dry run for the lab final. So you're gonna, have to get that going on your own there, Ian, because you wrote in the chat, is there a pre-recorded lab video? And there's not. So you should have no problem. I went through the lab and it took me, maybe an hour to do everything. So, assuming it takes you a little bit longer to kind of find the things that you're looking for, it shouldn't take you more than a couple hours, which is what the lab final is designed to take. It's created to take about 2 hours to do. All right. So if I need to leave early, is there a certain point where I could leave and I'd understand what to do? Well, Louis, I'm going to start the lab, this week's lab in the lecture. So make sure you watch the lecture video, because I'll stop that. And then when we go in the lab, I'll start recording the lab video when we go through some of the other steps. But if you combine those two, you should get everything that you need for the lab today. Won't that be early? I'm not sure. Yeah, it's going to go a little bit early, but then.
Oh, I meant like it won't be that early. Like I won't be leaving that early. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, then you should be okay, at least to get things started. All right. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, let me share my screen, and hopefully you can see this here. So here's week 15. So today we're going to cover deployment technologies and router remote access and VPNs. You have quiz 4 that is due this week. So again, it's just 25 questions, multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blank, open book, open note, open whatever you want to open. And then lab 14 is here. So here's the document and then where you submit it. Okay, so that's all stuff you're familiar with. And then next week, you won't see this because I have it hidden until the 7th. It will open at 12:01 a.m. on Monday morning. So here's the final exam, and then the lab final, and then the document for the lab final. So this is where you submit the lab final. And when you go in here, and again, you won't be able to do this until later, but I have the rubric here. So some of these things are very, very easy to do, right? Create the VMs. If you create the 5 VMs that we're going to need to create and you name them properly, you're going to get 10 out of 10. If you design the networks properly and name them properly, you're going to get 10 out of 10. If you do create the users and the organizational units correctly, you'll get 10 out of 10. The DHCP, you should be able to set that up pretty straightforward now. That's 10 out of 10. And the only new part that you haven't seen yet, but you'll see today, is designing the trust, the relationship between the two domains. And the instructions are pretty straightforward, and you shouldn't have any problem there. So my hope is that everyone will do really well on the lab final, is just like you did. Most of you did very well on the lab midterm. Okay, so that's where we're at, and that's the end of the class. Hard to believe 16 weeks has already come and gone. So I'm going to open the PowerPoint here, and we'll make this full screen. And today's lecture, I'm going to spend the bulk of our time talking about install. Now, when this class is in a face-to-face format, we actually build on our network in room 405, which is where this class normally is located, we build a Windows deployment server environment and then do the remote install of our server. And then inside of our server, we build our own Windows deployment server, and then we deploy our virtuals via Windows deployment. So that's not possible to do over remote technology. So we're not going to actually do this stuff, get some hands-on it, but we will talk about it. All right. So installing, right? We need to get data onto these hard drives somewhere, somehow. So these are the old 5 1/4 hard drives, which are big old boat anchors. All right. So what are we going to look at today? We're going to look at the install methods. We're going to talk about the differencing or the differences between imaging, backing up, and cloning. And then we'll talk about Windows solutions with the remote install server, which then became the Windows deployment server, and some other options. All right. So we're going to explore how do we get server, Linux, and OS 10 on our machines. So the first method, and it's probably the one that most of us have had some experience with, is using some sort of optical media. Now, even though we don't have physical media in our virtual environments, when we copy to our desktop those ISO images from our server. So let me go to my machine here. And so when we copied onto our server the CISOs, right? These CentOS ISO, the Kali Linux ISO, Server 2019, Eval ISO, and Win10 ISO. These files are the same ones that you would use to burn a DVD. So, you can right click on these burn disk image, and if you had a DVD burner, it would create the optical media. Now we use these within our virtual environment to boot as if they're a CD. So like I can come into the settings of one of my machines, go into the DVD drive, and quote unquote insert a DVD by saying boot from or media image file, and then I can browse to an ISO, which is very, very similar to inserting a CD or a Blu-ray into our media, into our drive. Now, this method is becoming more and more obsolete. And the reason for that isn't because DVDs are, a bad way of doing anything. They're not. They're great because, one, once you burn the ISO to a DVD, it's permanent, right? You have that, and you can, stick it in your briefcase or your toolkit, and you always will have an install option. The part that has gone obsolete is the actual DVD optical drives. So most servers, if we were to go configure a server, so let me open a website and go to Servers Direct, which this is a good place to go buy some servers. So if I come into servers, custom build, and if I just want, say, a rack mount server, and we'll go with an Asus motherboard, and it's going to want to quote, but there's a area here where you can rack mount, view the brands. There's a place on here. I haven't been on this site, and this is out of City of Industry, so it's real close to us. But you can go and build them, and if you build your own, you can get an option where you can insert a DVD drive if you need those in your server. So it's still available, but it's not common. And we really see this on our desktop machines, right? Very few desktop computers anymore because of the move to miniaturize and shrink the form factor, you know, to the mini and micro ATX. There's no room for any of these optical drives. Okay. Now, optical media is a common type of installation media, and this includes both ISO files and actual optical. So that's why it's very common. The optical side of it is not super common, but the ISO side is. Okay, and then the method that has probably taken over the majority of the install, and when this class is again face-to-face, I know I'm probably going to say that, you know, 50 times today. When it's face-to-face, the way we install almost everything is with USB. So at the beginning of the class, when we start with VMware ESXi, we do that with a USB drive. When we switch over to Hyper-V, we do that by creating a USB drive. Okay, so this is a very common method for doing that. And it's easy to boot from USB. You know, you just go into the boot menu. On a lot of machines, you just hit F9 and it'll open the boot menu. And then you can select, assuming you have the USB drive created properly and inserted into a functioning USB drive, you can just boot right from it and take it from there. Okay. Another method that was used, is not commonly used today, is you could just create a network share with the proper permissions for the admins, right? The IT administrators, and then just take from the Windows optical disk, copy, there was a folder called i386, and you'd copy that to the network. And then all you had to do is boot to the network and point it to that i386 and then run setup.exe, and it would run the install across the network. Now, the problem with that is, one, after Windows 2003, with Windows Vista and 2008, Server 2008, Microsoft changed from the i386 to a different method of how they do the install. So they went from setup.exe to the install.wim and the boot.wim folder and file. Okay, so they changed the way they do the install, and that changed this option. The other reason this wasn't very good or productive is that it was very slow, and it would slow down your network. Now, this was normally done on the same network that your production software was running. So your regular work from your clients is done on the production network. And if you did an install across the network, your network would come to a creeping halt. It would just like slow down super fast. So there was times where I would do an install across the network, and I just would put my phone on do not disturb, so it would go right to voicemail, because as soon as I do that, I start getting phone calls. Hey, the network slowed down. I don't know what's going on. And I was like, yeah, I'll look into that. I knew what it was because I was doing an install across the network, and thankfully they didn't take that long. But you just knew it was going to have an adverse effect on the performance of your network. So that was one of the downsides to that. And then the way that is probably the most preferred way is to use your network card and a network-based installation server. And the way this works is takes your network card and it uses what's called the PXE, or the pre-execution environment feature of the network card, to boot from the network using the trivial file transfer protocol, so TFTP. Now it uses IP to get the IP addresses, uses UDP, DHCP, and then TFTP for the network protocols to actually communicate with the installation server. Now this is different than installing across the network, because across the network, you just boot the machine onto your network. So you need drivers that will get it onto your existing network. So it's just a client machine. And then you run setup.exe. With a PXE installed, the network card looks for and the server answers the PXE request, and then it launches the installer automatically or in stages. Okay. Now, you have to have a PXE enabled network card. And most machines today, whether it's a laptop or a desktop or a server, will have a network card that is PXE capable. Now you do have to go into the settings and enable it. So here's showing where it says PXE on the boot option. Go in and boot from the PXE, and you would normally have to also go into the integrated peripherals and enable that. So otherwise it won't show up in your boot options. Okay. Now there are other machines or other servers that take advantage of PXE boot as well. And I'll talk about some of those near the end of this lecture. But for now, just know that that is a method. And this is really probably the cleanest, because with a network share, you have to have that all created. With USB, you have to have created the USB drive. With ISOs, you have to have downloaded the ISO and burn it to a CD, or have it downloaded in your virtual environment. Whereas with PXE, once you set up the network and the client is enabled, it's ready to go. So when at the end of the semester, so in the summer term, at some point, I'll come on campus and I'll go through and I'll reinstall all the computers in room 401 and room 404 and room 405, and I'll reinstall all the servers. And, some of you go, man, that's a lot of work. And to be honest with you, it takes about an hour to do, almost over 100 machines. And the reason is because all I have to do is go up to them, boot into the network, boom, boom, select, walk away. And by the time I say room 401, where I go around all the computers, by the time I get to the last computer, the first 5 or 6 computers are done already. Then I do the same thing on 404, 405, the servers. And before you know it, before I get in my car down in the parking lot, they're all done, ready to go. So then when we come in on the first day of class, we have a clean install of our machines. And I do that using Windows Deployment Server and PXE boot. Okay. Another topic that you should be aware of, especially if you're thinking of getting your Server Plus certification exam from CompTIA, which I would highly recommend it, especially if you took the CNET58, the Server Plus prep class in the winter. Between that class and this class, everything you need to know to be very successful on the Server Plus exam and certification. And the other thing is the Server Plus is a lifetime cert. So once you pass it one time, you never have to take it again. It will be you can keep it on your resume for the rest of your career. But this topic is from the Server Plus, and it asks, what's the difference between imaging and cloning? And with cloning, you actually copy one hard drive sector by sector. So physically, this drive is copied to another drive. And whatever's on your target is completely overwritten. Now, some common sense here says the target has to be the same size or larger than the source, right? You can't copy, a terabyte drive onto a 500 gig hard drive. I mean, it doesn't work that way. There's more sectors on the source than there are on the target, so it won't work. So you have to make sure that the drives are equal or bigger when they're the target drive. So on cloning, everything gets copied. On imaging, the copy of the source drive is every sector is copied to a file. And then that file is moved to the new drive or the new network location. Okay. And then a backup is just the saving of data from one location to another location. Now, we could use cloning and imaging to become a backup solution. But remember, last week we talked about backups, and one of the problems with backups, if we do it that way, is their size and the amount of time it takes to perform them. So we always have to weigh that in here. Okay, so any questions on the difference between cloning, imaging, and backing up? Pretty straightforward, and these are good definitions here. All right, so here's a image that shows, here's a device, here's the source disk, the active system disk, and then here's our target disk. So whatever's on here gets wiped out, okay? And then it becomes the same as the other. And there's a command in Linux. Linux is has a lot of tools to perform cloning and imaging and backing up. And there are some live distributions. Diskpart is a good one. Clonezilla is another good one that you can download and burn. And when I know several of you still need to take CNET58, right? Which will I'm glad to tell you that it's going to be offered in the fall. Now the lecture will be online, and then the lab will be face-to-face. So it's going to be a hybrid class. But in that class, in the lab, we go through and we use almost all of these tools that I talk about today: Clonezilla, Diskpart, all of the USB boot creation tools. We're going to use all of those to, and I recommend, now we'll use the school's USB drives to, USB sticks to do it. But I recommend if you have the USB sticks, come in and make your own, use yours if you want to, or the school's, and then just keep yours. Don't keep the ones from the school, obviously. But that way you have all these tools so that when you get on the job, you're ready to rock and roll. Okay. So, so after cloning, the disk looks identical to the other one. Now the disk name, the ID of it will be different, but it's going to be the same. Okay. And then with cloning, with imaging, we have our console, and then we locate over the network, we want to clone or image this machine, and we'll send that image to a network share. And then that's if it's online. And then we can also do it where we'll take it, clone it, or image it. Sorry, I'm using these words interchangeably. They're not. But we'll image it to a DVD and then transfer that image to the network share later. Okay. All right. So that's pretty straightforward there. And then the next section I want to talk about briefly is this idea of how do we do a Pixie boot? So with our Pixie machines, Windows with Server 2000 and then Server 2003, they had a service, just like we can add a feature to our machines, and we can still do this. This is still on our machine. So like if I come into my host machine, server manager, and then do add roles and features, I can come down here to Windows deployment server, and I can create a Windows deployment server on my host, on my machine. It's still there. Just early on, this was called remote installation server, or RIS. They changed it after 2003. So in 2008 and above, it's now known as Windows deployment server. But it uses a PXE boot, DHCP, and then the trivial file transfer protocol. And you select the image on the server that you want to boot from, and then you create what's known as an answer file. And so it answers, what's the machine name? What's the domain name? What's the user account creation? What's the time zone? How do you want to partition the hard drive? All those things that we normally have to do manual on an install, it's automated. Okay. Now, RIS, if you have older machines with Windows XP or older, you can do it on Windows deployment, but you have to do a workaround where you have to actually make a clone and then an image of one of your workstations and then deploy the image, not the actual install media. Okay. But the older ones was RIS. And then in 2008 and server 2012, 2019 and beyond, it uses what's known as Windows Deployment Services, or WDS. And it's the same PXE boot, same DHCP, same trivial file transfer protocol. And with WDS, you can do both 32 and 64-bit operating systems. With RIS, it only worked on 32-bit operating systems. So it kind of ran out of its functional worth when everything went 64-bit, right? Now, with Windows Deployment Server, you can install Windows 7, Server 2008 and above. So anything after Windows 7 is a candidate to be hosted and used on a Windows deployment server. Okay. And you can capture images, you can store them, and then you can redeploy them. So if I wanted to, and we do this every now and then, we'll set up one machine exactly the way we want it, right? We'll install all the patches, all the updates, all the service packs. We'll install the software that we want, Adobe Acrobat and, Chrome and whatever, set it up, name it the way we want. And then we'll capture that machine using Windows deployment and store it as an image, then redeploy that with Windows deployment to our other machines. So it's a handy way of doing that and that's a time saver, right? I know, like in CNET50, before we do the lab final in CNET50, when we're face to face. Now, I can't again do this while we're online, but when we're face to face, we'll boot the machines into the Windows deployment and re-image them the last day of class. And the students do it, they just follow the instructions. They probably don't even know what they're, the technology they're using, but that's actually Windows deployment. And it's ready to rock and roll. Nice, clean install. Okay. Now, again, the machines need to have a PXE initiated deployment, which means their network card has to be PXE boot. Now, here's one area that this install method kind of doesn't work real well. And that's if you're using wireless or USB Ethernet adapters. Wireless and USB Ethernet are not PXE bootable. So typically, the network card has to be an integrated network card to have those features. So if you go buy a USB Ethernet adapter and look at the settings, you're not going to find Pixie on it, at least not on probably the 99% of them. Okay, so keep that in mind. So if you have a bunch of, say, Chromebooks or something that doesn't have an Ethernet adapter on it, you may have to come up with another deployment method. Now, Chrome has a very simple internet-based reinstall. So you really won't need it for a Chromebook. That's not a great example, but all right. And then we can also do multicasting, which helps tremendously with the bandwidth considerations, because multicasting sends the packets to multiple addresses at the same time. So when I start server 1, Pixie boot, install, then go to server 2, server 3, server 24, all those images are grabbing the information from the network, but the network's really only sending it one time. So it sends it and then multiple machines grab it, the part they need. So there's not a lot of bandwidth. So it's pretty good for that. Okay. Now, with Pixie initiated deployments, it lets the client computers request a deployment over the network. So the technician, now you have to have permissions, and normally you'll put an account on the Windows deployment server. So someone can't just bring in their own computer, plug it into your network, and then steal a copy of Windows 10 from your corporate network, and away they go. I mean, you'll put an account on there, so they have to authenticate. But in this method, the operating system image and a Windows PC boot image are sent to a distribution point that is configured to accept Pixie boot requests. And that's the Windows deployment server, or the remote install server. Okay. Multicast deployments conserve network bandwidth by concurrently sending data to multiple clients instead of sending a copy of the data to each client. In this method of deployment, the operating system image is sent to a distribution point. This in turn deploys the image when the client requests the deployment. So it's not, the whole thing isn't copied, only the parts necessary. And that's the beauty of multicasting. The bootable media deployments let you deploy the operating system when the destination computer starts. When the destination computer starts, it retrieves the task sequence, the operating system image, and any other required content from the network. So the way Windows deployment works is you need either a DVD or an ISO. And then there's two parts to Windows deployment. There's the boot image, and then there's the install image. So you have to boot from the bootloader that comes with the version of Windows. Now, the nice thing is Windows 10, Server 2012, Server 2019 are all, they use the same one. If you boot from a Windows 7 image, boot image, and then try to deploy or install Server 2019, it's not going to work. So you have to make sure that you name your boot images properly, because you can't boot from Windows 7 and then install something other than Windows 7. It won't work properly. Now they fix that with Windows 10. It will work for all the other servers, but not vice versa. Okay, so you want to keep that in mind. Now, environments where it's not practical to copy an operating system image or other large packages over the internet, a standalone media deployment will accommodate that. So environments without network connectivity or low bandwidth network connectivity, this is a good way of doing that as well. Okay, now you can pre-stage your deployment that lets you deploy an operating system to a computer that's not fully provisioned. So what fully provisioned means is that not everything is in place yet. So the pre-stage media is a Windows imaging format. So the file has the extension of WIM. So if I come in, so I'm gonna go into my local machine here, and I'm gonna find a let me go to my machine here. So here's an ISO, a Windows ISO. So in Windows, if I double click on an ISO, it mounts it as a DVD drive. Okay. So now if I look at my computer, see this this iDrive is actually that ISO image that I just double clicked. So if I come in here, notice that there's a boot folder, and inside the boot folder, there's going to be the WIM file. So that's actually under the sources. And yeah, here's a WIM. So there's the install.wim file. So when we go into our WDS server, when we create an image, it will ask us for where those files are. So if so we'll look at the WIM file. So here's the install.wim and then the boot.wim. So it's in the sources folder, not in the boot. But anyway, this boot.wim, that is the file that if we were to look at the coding in this autorun.inf, let's see if we can edit this, open with Notepad. And see, this just shows, use this icon and open setup.exe. So the setup.exe file, inside of here, it will say, go to the sources and find the boot.wim when it starts up. Or if you're done with the boot phase, go to the install.wim to install it. Okay, so I'm going to get out of this. So I need to eject this CD. And that was just from an ISO. Okay, so working with this is really straightforward. And the nice thing is the Windows Deployment Server wizard, when you launch it, it walks you right through it. So it's not difficult at all. Okay, so there are 3 basic actions that you can take to deploy an operating system on a destination computer. 1, you can build and capture an image and then distribute it to a distribution point. You can create and configure the task sequence that installs the operating system image, and then you can deploy the task sequence. So here's our Pixie client, and first we go into the network boot, which normally is F12. Different BIOSes and UEFIs will have a different keystroke. So you'll have to figure that out on your machine. But if you go F12, it'll boot from the network, and then you need to have a DHCP server on your network segment. And the other thing is Pixie, because it uses UDP, it is not routable. I cannot be on network 1, go through a router to network 2, through another router to network 3, where my deployment server is, without creating routing rules specific for the UDP protocol, because both DHCP and TFTP use UDP. They don't use TCP. Okay. And those of you that have taken the networking class know TCP is guaranteed delivery, whereas UDP is best effort. So it just tries. If it fails, it's over. And if it goes to a router, it doesn't make it through without a routing rule. You have to specify either a static or dynamic routing protocol to do that. Okay, so it looks for DHCP, and then it points it to the boot image or the capture image on our deployment server, and then that's sent to the client, and then DNS is there, so it will create a DNS record, put it in the domain controller. So you need a domain controller as well. And then it gives you the options, and then everything's sent to the server. Okay. So now the trash man's on the other side of the street. All right. And then within our Windows deployment services, so once it's set up, we can create image groups and then add our Windows boot images. Okay. So, and then once we get to past the boot, it will say, what do you want to install? And this is where we can have an option of saying, well, I want Windows 7 Professional, or I want Windows Vista for the HPs. Whatever you've set up, you can just go from there. And the nice thing is, once you have these images created, you can do what's known as a slipstream update to update the image. So if there's new Windows updates or new features or new things you want to add to it, you can just slip those into it without having to deploy it, update it, capture it, and then redeploy it. So it's a handy way of taking care of all that. Okay, another kind of a side way of doing this is if you don't have WDS, so if you don't have a Windows server available, Microsoft makes what's known as the MDT, the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, that you can use to deploy Windows and Office. And it supports 3 types of deployments. So there's the zero touch installation, the light touch installation, and then the user driven installation. And with the zero touch, obviously, that means you just launch it and it takes everything from there. So with that, you need an answer file in your, it's actually in your sysprep folder is where you put the answer file. And then with the light touch, that means the client or the technician on the Pixie boot. Now, all this is going to use Pixie again, but the technician will have to answer 1 or 2 questions, and then it takes it from there. And then with the user-driven installation, that's where the user, the client, or the technician has to answer almost all the questions. So it's like an install from media, but the user is there to answer the questions from the installer. So zero touch is fully automated. The user-driven installation is completely manual, and the light touch is in between. All right. And any questions so far on any of these deployment methods? Everybody okay with this so far? I know this isn't the most exciting topic in the world, but this is, if there was one thing that, you know, if I could go back and talk to myself, say 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and if there was something I could have learned way back then that would have made my life a lot easier, it would have been this deployment stuff. You know, one, the technology wasn't super evolved way back then. But 2, you know, I did a lot of installs from either floppy disks or from CDs, because that's the only way I knew, right? So, you know, we'd go buy 100 computers, and I would tell my direct report, which was the president at the time, I'd say, I can save probably $50 to $100 per machine if I build them myself. And if we build them on in our department, have IT build them. And then we could buy, instead of buying 100, we could buy 150 or whatever, right? Get more. And but that means that they didn't come with an operating system on them, right? They're just blank hard drives. So we would, have a workbench in our server room where we had 4 connections on KVMs. So we could only do an install on 4 of them at a time. So, that when you're talking about 150 computers, that's like one guy or 2 guys are in there installing Windows all day long for, 2 or 3 days in a row just to get a bunch of machines ready. So with this zero touch or Windows deployment, it would have been as easy as, let's just build the computers, power them on, make sure they actually boot into something, turn them off, put them in the workstation or the office where they're going to go, and then just boot from the network and install the operating system, walk away. So it takes as long as someone carrying it to wherever it needs to go, the office that it's designed for, power it on, answer a couple questions, boom, Windows is installed. And Office and Outlook and all that stuff that they need, their network shares are all mapped. All that's done. Whereas with the other way, it's all manual. So, this would be one of those time savers that I wish I'd have known about. Okay, so with the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, it looks and acts very much like Windows Deployment Server or a remote installation server. The only difference is this will run on any machine, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10. It will also run on a server, but if you have a server, WDS is probably cleaner. Okay, and then you just come through and you create with these levels here. You answer the questions that need to be answered through this thing, and then you save it, and it will save an answer file, and then it will automatically pick that up when you do your installs. All right. So I'm gonna stop right here because it's 8:53, and then we'll take a short break. Let's come back at 9:05. So we'll go about 10 minutes. This first break, I want to make sure it's long enough to get a cup of coffee and whatever else. And then we'll come back and we'll look at other options other than the ones we've looked at so far. So like there are other technologies like Norton Ghost, right? In 1998, Norton Ghost was a big deployment system. And I've used Norton Ghost a ton of times. And it's extremely efficient. It's a network-based install, so it does slow down things on your network. But we'll look at Norton Ghost, we'll look at Acronis, we'll look at some of these other options as well. Okay, so I'm gonna stop this recording or pause it, and then we'll take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back. All right, hopefully you had a good break. Let me share my screen again. And we'll come back to this. All right, so I do want to also open the lab file real quick for you. And I want to explain something, because this one has some wording that's a little bit different than we've had previously. All right, so here's the lab file. So again, connect to Authy, and away we go. So let's look at this topology first. So you can see we need to build 2 brand new machines for this lab. We have an RRAS. We have a Win 10 and Win 2, 10.1 and 10.2 already, right? So this topology shows we need to build a server AD-DHCP-file-1 and file-2. And what we're going to do is we're going to say everything on this side is the 192.168 1.0 network, and that's going to be the CNET.lab domain. And on the other side of this router will be the 192.168 2.0 network, and that's the electronics.lab domain. So we're going to have two separate domains. Now, notice that it says this is how we're going to set everything up. But when you go through the lab write-up, it's as if I wrote this lab as if we do not have any of this stuff pre-existing. So we don't have RAS already. We don't have Win 10. We don't 1 and 2. Okay. So when you read this, it's as if you're starting from zero, from nowhere. So, you know, it says create two internal switches, LAN A and LAN B. Well, you already have that. Well, today you have it, but next week for the lab final, notice here this last step in today's lab is to remove everything. So you're going to delete everything and over the weekend, I'm going to, if you haven't removed it, I'm going to. So when you come in Monday morning, if you get on and say, well, I'm going to start the lab final on Monday. Now, remember, you have until Friday at midnight to do it next week. And you say, well, I'll just use my existing machines. They're not going to be there. They're going to be deleted. Okay. So that's why I wrote this lab as if we're starting from scratch. So it says create two switches. So if you wanted to, and this is where the dry run part of this comes into play, is if you wanted to start and do this exactly like next week, you could go through and delete all of your existing virtual machines and all of your existing hard drives, with the exception of the parent hard drives, and delete the LAN A and LAN B internal networks, and then start and go through this from the beginning. Okay. If you want to use what's there, for today, I don't care how you do it, as long as you get it to work. But next week, you're going to have to, you know, it's a clean slate for the lab final. Okay, so you can do this, create the Active Directory DHCP-file-1 virtual machine, add a new virtual machine, create the VM, give it a dynamic hard disk, and then here I say either install Server 2019 from the ISO or create the differencing disk. So if you do the differencing disk, obviously, you know, you do this part first, and then you create the VM second. So, you know, at this point, you should know how to create a VM. You know, after 16 weeks of doing it, 15 weeks after today, you'll be very good at doing this. Then notice I say, change the network connection Hyper-V from the internet. So when you start it, it will be on the internet connection, which is that Intel connection. And then you want to change it to LAN A. And we do that is so that the 180-day evaluation starts. And this is where we're going to run into, and some of you have seen this already, is if the machine runs, if that evaluation is not enabled. So let me show you what I'm talking about there. So if I come into, I'll just do my AD-DHCP one. Now I've already created mine, but I'm going to start this up. And if it's not on the internet, so if it doesn't have internet access, the licensing, the 180-day license it says it's expired. So let me show you what's going to happen here. So we'll get that started. All right, so while that's running, we want to make sure it has internet connectivity to get that 180-day evaluation going. And then we'll change it to LAN 8. And then we're going to do the same thing for Active Directory DHCP file 2, and then RRAS, and then Windows 10.1 and Windows 10.2. Now, for this week, we already have these machines, right? We have Windows 10.1, we have Windows 10.2, and we have RRAS. So you don't have to recreate those. The only thing you'll have to do is on Windows 10.1 is you'll need to remove it from the CNET.lab domain that we've created previously, because this CNET.lab is on a different domain controller. So you need to remove this machine from that domain and put it in a work group, and then go from the work group back to CNET.lab. Same thing with RRAS is remove it from CNET.lab, put it in a work group, and just leave it in the work group. And then the other thing with RAS that you'll have to change is you have to disable the routing remote access and then re-enable it with only LAN routing. We don't want NAT on there for this one, okay? And then get rid of that third network card. And then Windows 10.2 is fine the way it is. It's not on any domain. All right. So here I am on my AD-DHCP-file 1. And when I log on, it's going to tell me on here that the license is going to load Server Manager real quick. So I'll get a notice on here in just a second that says that the license is expired. And what will happen is if this does not say that the license is good for 180 days or 160, whatever the number is, this machine, AD-DHCP file 1, will automatically turn off after 1 hour. So this is a frustrating thing for both this and the lab final, is if you're working on these machines, right, you get these set up, you're going to minimize it and then go do something else somewhere else. And all of a sudden this machine turns off. And you're like, why can't I join the domain with Windows 10.2? And it's because your electronics.lab domain controller turned off. So the way around that is to come into the settings. Now on this one, I'm not going to do it because I already set it up, and change it from LAN A to Intel. Let it get where it says the license is good for 180 days, restart that machine, and then go and change it and then set up the network. All right. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? I got a comment. Will the sysprep parent disk be no, those will stay. The parent disks, I want you to save those. Okay, so here, let me show you on another machine what you need to have on there. So here's my R4. So this is when you're done with today's lab. Need that. Yeah, see how this says license is valid? That means this won't turn off after an hour. If you don't see that, that means it will turn off after an hour. All right, so here's what you're going to clean up out of here. You're just going to come into all of these and remove them. Delete. Don't ask me again. Delete. 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 So all these are going to go bye-bye. And delete. All right. And then if I come into my where my hard drive files are. So notice these are in my recent files. I can just go open file location to get there. I'm going to delete all these disk drive files too, and with the exception of the parent drives. So I'm going to do everything except for Win10 parent and Win server parent. Okay, so when you come onto your machine on next week for the lab final, you should only have those two hard drives in there and no VMs, but you should have access to your ISOs. So, I mean, we can delete CentOS 8, doesn't matter. So if you wanted to, and you can do this today as well, if you really want this to be a dry run for the lab final, delete everything now. You don't have to, right? But for the lab final, this is what your machine's going to look like, is exactly like this. So if I say create a new Windows 10 1, you can do it two ways, right? You can come new virtual machine and then boot from the ISO and install Windows 10. And then you can do that for Windows 10 too. And then you can do that for your server and your other server and your router, right? You can do the install, or you can just come in and do a new hard drive like we've done for all the other machines. So either way, however you want to do it is fine with me. Okay. So now, again, this lab is written in a way that it kind of says you're starting from scratch. This week, you're not necessarily starting from scratch because we do have Windows 10 1, Windows 10 2, and our router already configured. Now we have to reconfigure the router, and then we need to work with the domain on there, but that's available for you. All right. Any other questions on that? So what we should do now, since we're on our machine, you don't have to delete anything right now, Luis. You can leave those on there, but at the end of today's lab, you need to delete those. So whenever you finish this lab, make sure they're deleted. So here's what you can do on your server. So log into your server on Guacamole, and we're going to do new hard disk. This is the fastest way. So we're going to do VHDX. It's going to be a differencing disk. And we're going to call this AD-DHCP file-1. And we're going to base this on our Win server parent disk. Right? So the same thing we've done, multiple times. Then we're going to do it again. New hard disk. Next, VHDX, differencing. Now, because I deleted everything, I can't use my existing ones, which is fine. File 2, next, parent. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing for, let me cancel that, for my Windows 10 1 and Windows 10 2. 10 1. And then for this one, I'm going to say Windows 10 parent. That's the disk I want to base it on. Do the same thing here, hard disk. Differencing. Win10 parent. Okay, now I need to do one more hard disk for my router because I deleted it. VHDX, differencing. This one I'm going to call RAS. Win10, Win server parent. Okay, so now I've just created all my hard drives for all my machines. Okay, now I'm going to do new virtual machine. And I'm going to call this AD-DHCP-file-1. It's going to be a Gen 1. I'm going to give it 4 gigs of RAM. I'm going to connect it to the internet so I get that license taken care of. I'm going to use an existing hard drive, which is that file I created there. Finish. Now I have that one. I'm going to do the same thing. File 2, Gen 1, 4 gigs of RAM. Connected to the Intel. Use that hard drive I created. AD file 2. Next, finish. Now I'm going to do another one. I can give everybody 4 gigs of RAM. That's no problem. And I'm going to use my RAS disk. And do this twice more. Gen 1. Use existing hard drive. So you get the idea here, hopefully. I mean, again, we've done this probably 15 times. Yes, right now it's optional. You do not have to delete everything right now. You do have to delete everything at the end of the lab. I'm just showing you how to do it if you do delete everything. If you don't, you already have some of these. All right, so now I have all of the machines I need on this. Now, if I come into the virtual switch manager, you probably have already deleted these, or you will have LAN A, LAN B. They're not hard to recreate, so we'll just leave those in there. But now I've done everything in the lab file right here. So I created those switches. I created Active Directory DHCP file 1, file 2, created RAS, created Windows 10 and Windows 2. So Windows 10 2. So now what I need to do is come in here and just start all these. So I'm going to just start these in the background. And we'll let those get started up, because that's going to go through and install them or use that parent disk where it's sysprepped. So everything is going to look like it's going to ask for, do you accept the conditions? What's the password? And then on Windows 10, you need to put in, join the domain later, all those different things that we do with our install. Okay. So I'm going to let those run in the background, then we'll come back to that. Okay. So I do want to get back into the lecture. So you can do that if for sure do that for AD-DHCP-file 1 and file 2. You need to do that because we don't have those machines yet. The RAS and the Win10 1, Win10 2, if you want to use the ones you have, you can. If you want to start from scratch, which I think is the best practice for next week's lab, the lab final, then do what I just did. All right. So while you're doing that in the background, let me finish or talk about some other options here with the install. Okay. So one of the bigger players in this imaging and remote install is, it has been Norton Ghost. Norton utilities, right? They're probably most known for their VPN and their antivirus right now. But one of their biggest products was Norton Ghost. And GHOST is an acronym for General Hardware Oriented System Transfer. And disk cloning programs are not primarily backup programs. They can be used for that. So a key feature of a backup program is allow the retrieval of individual files without needing to retrieve the entire backup. So in 2013, Symantec, which owns Norton, they scrapped GHOST, and they have a new program called System Recovery. So here's a picture of the System Recovery product, and it has a free trial. There's also, this supports the newer version of Windows, whereas GHOST didn't. And you can back up an image to just about anything, whether it's Blu-ray, Firewire, NAS, SAN, or a USB. You can schedule the backups to run automatically. Built-in encryption. So, one thing, we always say you got to have a backup. Well, if I have a USB drive on my desktop that contains a full backup of my system, and somebody steals my USB drive, can't they just do a restore to their own hardware from my backup? And don't they have all my files? Absolutely, they do. So we want to secure our backups as well, because if, that'd be like saying, well, here's my key to my house, but I have a copy of the key under the mat. So I'm going to secure my key, but not secure the one under the mat, the backup copy. It doesn't make any sense. So this is where you can encrypt your backup. So even if someone gets your data of your backup, they still can't do anything with it. Okay, some other benefits: it dramatically minimizes downtime, replaces time-consuming manual and error-prone desktop and laptop recovery processes, and allows you to recover what you need. All right, there's other features here. There are free open source GHOST, which this is called Fog. So there's a project out there called Fog Server, which is like GHOST, except for it's all open source. Whereas GHOST, Norton, you had to buy. This is free. It uses Pixie, and it takes it from there. There's actually an app for your phone with your Fog servers. So you could, this would be really nice, is I wouldn't even have to come on campus to re-image all my machines. I could just go into my phone and say, okay, room 405, station 1, station 2, and just select them, and then select the option that says on reboot, re-image it. So then all I'd have to do is just tell somebody that's on campus, hey, can you go in and turn off and turn on all the computers in room 405? And that way I don't even have to leave my desk in my office at my house. Okay. Other options, you'd be everywhere at once. So this is with Fog. There's another deployment system called a Acronis Snap Deploy, which allows you to, again, the administrator can either upload the agent to Pixie or burn it to a CD, and then it grab the whatever system you want, put the machine, the image onto it, and then away you go. So this is a big field in IT, right? And different shops, different IT environments will have different technologies that they're going to use. So you may see Symantec, you may see Fog, you may see Acronis, you may see all kinds of different things. I like Windows deployment because it comes with Windows, and I have access to Windows, no problem. Okay. Now, one thing with some of these imaging systems is it has problems with the hardware abstraction layer. And a good example of this is if you've ever taken your hard drive out of your computer and put it in another computer and then start it up, and you get all these errors, right? You may get blue screens, you may get hardware errors, because the hardware that's installed or set up for Windows on your original desktop machine is probably different in your new desktop machine. So if I just take the hard drive out and put it in another machine, it thinks there's all this other hardware, and you'll get these errors. And that's because the hardware abstraction layer. So Acronis does something where it actually does these, it fixes that on the fly. So it is a very efficient solution for that. Other options, there's this ultimate deployment appliance utility, which is a virtual machine that you can download either in VMware. I believe there's an image for VirtualBox with Sun Microsystems VirtualBox. And you just download this appliance, and then you can add different images to it. And then as long as that virtual is running and it's on your network, you can use it to install just about anything. Yeah, this is, what do you mean, Luis? Professor, will this be recorded with the labs as well, right? Part of this is going to be in the lecture, part of this is going to be in the lab video. So there'll be two videos. You may have to look through them both to find everything you're looking for. Okay. Although the lecture video has mostly lecture and then just a couple things about the lab. All right. And I'll stop that once we switch into the lab. But this ultimate deployment, this is a really virtual it's a really flexible solution. Whereas Windows deployment can only deploy Windows machines, right? We can't use that for Linux. We can't use that for Mac. We can't use it for anything else. Whereas this ultimate deployment can do unattended installs for almost any other operating system. So you can publish your favorite recovery system, maintaining maintenance tools over the network. It's Pixie Boot, remote install, Kickstart, Jumpstart, AutoYas, all these systems in one system. So this is an option that I found that's really, really simple. So imagine when you go to your friend's house to fix their computer, you want to be prepared. Instead of removing all the unwanted stuff, you might as well start fresh. So you bring your own system, say your laptop, hook it up to the messed up system with a crossover cable, restart and reinstall the image from your UDA. So you'd have it on, say, VirtualBox, boot up UDA, cross connect, boot their computer. It will boot from the network, and away you go. You've got everything set up. So this is a really powerful system. It can do all of these different operating systems. So Linux, VMware, Windows, you name it, it's on there. So here's some links to some of those as well. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about as far as deployment stuff today. I do want to show this video. This video is about what is a trust relationship, because we're going to set that up today. So let me play this video real quick.
One part of the free Active Directory course. When you have one domain and one course, looking after.
Okay, so this is why we want to do a trust. Is by default, if we have two domains, which we will today in today's lab, CNET.lab and electronics.lab, and they're on two separate domain controllers, right? CNET.lab is going to be on the AD-DHCP-file1 domain controller. Electronics.lab is going to be on AD-DHCP-file2 domain controller. And they're connected with the router, but that doesn't mean if I have a user on electronics.lab, they don't have access to resources in the CNET.lab. And we want to do that. We want to say, okay, these two domains need to trust each other. Okay, so that's what this is going to explain.
Their Active Directory is quite easy. In fact, if you can stay with one domain and one forest, then you should do that. In the real world, this may not occur. Imagine this. Your company already has two large business units that work independently of each other. They have their own domain and child domains and own namespace. The company buys another company, which has its own forest and its own child domains. Your company expands, and with it, multiple new domains are created. Some of these new domains have child domains of their own. In order to meet the needs of your business, users in any domain must be able to access resources in any other domain. Remember that each domain effectively has its own copy of the Active Directory database. Each domain essentially runs by itself. So what happens when a user wants to access a resource in another domain? To make administration easy, Active Directory automatically creates a two-way trust relationship between parent and child domains. This trust relationship is called a transitive trust. A transitive trust simply means I trust you and any other domains that you decide to trust, or to quote a familiar saying, any friend of yours is a friend of mine. To understand transitive trust better, let's remove all the trusts and rebuild the relationships with non-transitive trusts. The parent domain wants to trust its child domains, so we would create two-way trusts like this. Now imagine that one of the child domains has two child domains of its own. In order for its children to trust the child domain, two trust relationships need to be created. So let's create two more two-way non-transitive trusts. Now the root domain wants to access the two new domains, so two more trusts need to be created. In order for the child domains to trust each other, two horizontal trusts need to be created like this. Lastly, the two new child domains need to be connected to the other child domain like this. This is a total of 10 trusts for 5 domains. I have only done a small part of the diagram, but imagine if I did the whole lot. In order to ensure everyone has access to each domain, you would need to create 66 trusts for the 12 domains shown. This is why non-transitive trusts do not scale well. They are great in that you can choose which domain accesses which domains. But on any decent-sized network, managing these trusts soon becomes very difficult. Let's go back to transitive trusts. Every child domain is connected to its parent domain. If the parent wants to access a resource in the bottom domain, it will go through the transitive trust of the child domain. The child domain will then pass the request through its trust relationship to its child domain. That's what a transitive trust is. It allows a trust to be extended outside the domain to which it is directly connected. Let's look at a different example. Say this domain wants to access this domain. It would go up to its parent. Its parent would pass the request to the root domain. The root domain would pass the request via a transitive trust automatically created between the trees in the forest. This trust is called a tree trust. It is essentially the same as a parent-child trust and is created automatically by Active Directory. Once the request passes over the tree root trust, it would finally be passed down by this domain to its child. In order to get to its destination, the request had to go over 4 transitive trusts, all of which were created automatically. You are probably thinking, this is great. I can share anything I want with anyone in the forest, and as long as I give them permissions to access the resource, Active Directory will do the rest. This is true, but could there be delays going over 4 transitive trusts to get to your destination, even if it is done automatically? In the real world, most of the time, the parent and child domains will do most of the sharing between each other. But sometimes you may have 2 domains that are quite a distance from each other in the hierarchy, but communicate with each other a lot. When this occurs, you can create what is called a shortcut trust. A shortcut trust provides a direct trust relationship between the two domains, saving them from having to go through the whole hierarchy. I think you will agree that creating an occasional shortcut trust where it is needed is a lot better than creating trusts between all the domains in the forest. In this particular case, we also have another company that has its own forest. Perhaps they are owned by the same company, but they want to keep their domains and forests separate. When this occurs, you can create what is called a forest trust. In order to create a forest trust, you must be running at least Windows 2003 Forest Functional Level. Forest trusts are not created by default and must be manually created by an administrator. Once created, any domain in either forest will be able to access resources in any other domain, assuming that they have access. Just like parent-child trusts, forest trusts are transitive. In some cases, you may create a trust relationship between Active Directory and a non-Active Directory system. Assuming both systems use Kerberos, you can create what is called a realm trust. These are created manually and can be either transitive or non-transitive, one-way or two-way. The last trust you may come across is an external trust. An external trust is generally used to connect to a Windows NT4 domain. These trusts need to be created manually and are non-transitive. They are also one-way only, but you can make them two-way by simply creating two trust relationships, one going in each direction. This covers all the different trusts in Active Directory. In most cases, you can see a trust relationship will be created for you automatically. The trust relationship is in both directions and is transitive, so new domains and child domains will automatically have access to each other. All the hard work is done for you. Two-way trusts are easy to understand and use. Resources are shared both ways. In some cases, you may have to deal with a one-way trust. Let's look at an easy way to understand the terminology when dealing with a one-way trust. Let's say you have domain A with a share in it. You have a user in domain B called John. The question is, does domain A trust John? In order for a user to access a resource in another domain, the other domain must trust that user. So the question is, does domain A trust John? You are told that domain A trusts domain B. Since John is in domain B, he can access resources in domain A. This, of course, assumes that John has access to these resources. The trust relationship only creates the path for a user to access a resource. It does not grant them permissions. If a user, Jane, is in domain A, she would not be able to access resources in domain B. In order for this to occur, domain B needs to trust domain A. If you get confused, draw an arrow between the two domains with the direction of the trust. In order for the user to access the other domain, the arrow must point towards the user. Now that we understand how trusts work, I will change my Windows server to demonstrate how to create trusts. To view the current trusts or make changes, open Active Directory Domains and Trusts from the Administrative Tools under the Start menu.
If you want to know why you're so tired so often, look at this banana. It's fresh, brightly colored.
As I expand down through the domains, notice that I have the East and West domain under my root domain and the sales domain under the East domain. All these domains are linked together via transitive trusts automatically created when the domains were created. If I select the root domain and then right-click and select Properties, I can then select the Trusts tab to view the trusts that are automatically set up. Currently, there are trusts in both directions set up between this domain and the child domains. The sales domain will not be shown since that trust relationship is between the East and sales domains. To create a new trust, select the option at the bottom, New Trust. Once you are past the welcome screen, enter in the domain, forest, or Kerberos realm for which you want to set up the trust. It is important that your DNS can resolve the other end before you perform this step. In this case, I will create a forest trust between the IT free training domain and the high cost training domain. At present, both domains are in the root domain of their own forest. Windows will find and detect that the other side is another forest. You could choose the first option, external trust, which will create a trust between the two domains. This is a non-transitive trust, so only the two domains selected will be able to use the trust. This is also the trust you would need to use for NT4 domains. In this case, I want to select the second option, forest trust. This will allow any domains in either forest to access any other domain in the other forest. On the next screen, you can select which direction the trust will go, or the default option, two ways. In this case, both forests will be sharing resources with each other, so I will accept the default option of two ways. The next screen gives you the option to create the trust in this domain or both domains. In a lot of cases, you won't have an account in the other forest. This is especially the case if the other forest is another company. If you do not have access, select the option, this domain only. In order for the trust to work, the other company will have to perform the same procedure in their Active Directory environment as I have just done. The next screen allows you to determine how the default authentication will work. In order for a user to gain access to a resource in another domain, they need to be given permission to that resource. Having said this, there are plenty of resources in a domain that everyone can access without permissions being set for that user. For example, authentication from a domain controller, or access to a share with permissions set to everyone. If the company is trusted, select the first option, forest-wide authentication. The user will still need to be given access to resources, but will be able to access any resource that is available to everyone and authenticate off domain controllers in the forest. In some cases, you may create a forest trust between your company and another company. In this case, you may want to be very careful about what you give them access to. In this case, you would select selective authentication. This option will only allow them to access servers that you decide they can access. This includes domain controllers. Using this option, you can select which domain controllers they can access just for authentication. This gives you more security, but takes a little bit more work to set up. In this case, I will select the option selective authentication to show you how to configure it. On the next screen, you get to enter in a password for the trust. This password will need to be entered in on the other side using the same wizard as here. When the two forests connect up for the first time, this password is used to ensure that both servers are talking to the correct party. The next screen will confirm that a forest trust is about to be created. Once I press next, I will be informed the forest trust was created. The next screen will ask you if you want to confirm the outgoing trust. So far, the trust has been created, but this step will confirm that the trust is working with the password I entered. Before you can perform this step, you need to ensure that an administrator in the other forest has completed this wizard and thus created their side of the trust. On the next screen, the incoming trust can also be confirmed. In this case, you will be required to use a username and password from the other forest. In a lot of cases, you may not have this, especially if you are connecting to another company. The wizard is now complete and the forest trust has been set up. The trust will appear in the outgoing and incoming trusts with the transitive trusts that have already been automatically created. Since I used selective authentication in the forest trust, I will now open Active Directory users and computers and give the administrator in the high-cost training domain access to authenticate from my domain controller. By default, the option that I am after will not appear. In order to get it to appear, open View and select advanced features. This will show a lot of options that are normally hidden. From here, I will open the domain controller's overview and open the properties for my domain controller. To give access, select the Security tab and then press the button Add. Since the Forest Trust has been added, I can now enter in the administrator from the high-cost training domain, and Windows will find the user without a problem, and they will be added to permissions listed in this domain controller. Once added, I need to tick the box Allowed to authenticate. Steps like these will need to be performed on every server that they need to access. This is more work, but does prevent users from accessing other resources on the network unless you specify that they can. That's it for Forest Trust. I will now go back to Active Directory domain and trusts and demonstrate how to create a shortcut trust. In this case, I will create.
All right, so we're just going to do a forest trust. So that's all we need from that video right there. And the rest of these slides, it's just another author's look at Windows deployment server. So this goes through the details of setting up Windows deployment. And again, when this course is face-to-face, that's how we do that. I mean, we do a lab where that's very important, but today we're not going to do that. So what I want to do is I want to come back into my server here. And remember, we created these and then we started them up. So what I need to do now is just finish. So this is what they'll look like after they get launched for the first time. I'm just going to next accept. And finish. Now I'm going to come in, do the same thing for this one. Okay. And same thing for this one. And then for Windows 10, I have to do the same thing. I'm in the US. That's correct keyboard. Skip. Some important setup. All right. Let me come back and might as well get Windows 10 2 going on the same thing. All right. And on these ones, I'm going to log in. All right, now we'll let these log in. Come back to my Windows 10 one. Accept the license agreement. And for the account, I'm going to do the join domain instead. A lot of these are, you know, just kind of click and wait. All right. So this will come up with the license next time. So what I can do on these machines, I can rename them real quick too. So, all right. So when you get to this screen, just do domain join instead. And we'll just call this CNET. And then CNET 2021. And then remember our pet CNET. We were born in CNET, and our childhood nickname was CNET. And do that for number 2. And this is stuff we've done before. So, I mean, this shouldn't be like anything you haven't seen about 10 times already. So I'll let that connect to the network. All right, so now see how that license is there? I want to see that for sure. License, good. License, perfect. Okay, this one's CNET. All right. And then this, I'll no to that. Decline that. I don't want help from Cortana. Accept the defaults. All right, so Windows 10's getting rolling. All right, so now this is AD/DHCP file 1. So what I want to do on this one, now that my license is ready, I can come up here and change the settings. Actually, I want to stop this video